In all my years hiking, I had never come across something as strange as this. I figured that sharing my story here would help piece together the series of events that plagued my life for the better part of 3 weeks. I apologize for any confusion. I am trying to get my bearings on this all as well. If you need any clarification or have questions, please ask them. I'll try to respond to comments when I can. Allison Jeanette Moore went missing on October 11, 2010. Her mother reported her missing after she failed to check in with her at the West River checkpoint. The case went cold in December, and soon after, she became just another face on a missing persons registry with a $25,000 reward tacked on. That was until about 2 weeks ago. Almost 10 years to the day she went missing, we found her shoe, smashed into the gap of a large boulder. Further up the mountain, there was a small cabin, one that should have been checked by the countless searches that had been conducted in the weeks following her disappearance. An oversight, albeit one that could have saved her. There was no body in the cabin, however, but they did find a diary, caked in mud and smeared almost beyond recognition. I had hiked the mountain myself dozens of times before. I know the trails, but I never remembered seeing a cabin. If it wasn't the sheer curiosity that would get me up there, it was the money. $25,000 for a pile of bones wasn't a bad deal. I prepped my gear and set aside 2 weeks to find her. I reached out to her mother about a week before and was able to get a copy of her diary. Some of the text was hard to read, but legible enough that I could make out what she was saying. The first entry gave me a vague idea of where she had been. If I could find my way to the cabin, I might be able to figure out where she went after that. I had tried to get in contact with the 2 hikers who found the cabin, but their names had been left out of the official reports. And despite my pleas, Ms. Moore kept that private. I flipped to the first page in the laminated binder. October 2nd, 2010. I'll be at the park in around 3 hours. The bus ride has been brutal so far. The roads are winding, and I usually don't get car sick, but this is bad. Can't wait for it to be over. I should have walked. I frowned slightly reading over the paragraphs. Knowing that you're reading the last words of someone, it's unnerving to say the least. The next paragraph was timestamped a little while later. October 2nd, 2010, 1:55 p.m. I just got to my hotel room. It's a little run down, but I won't be here long. I was going back over my supplies for the trip and realized I probably should have brought another pack of protein bars. Oh well, I have plenty of other things packed. It's quiet here. I think that it will help me get my mind off of everything. After all, it's meant to be an escape. 2 weeks of hiking will help me calm my nerves. I'm sure of it. I also need to remember to put new batteries in my GPS. That part was underlined and circled. I wasn't aware that she had a GPS on her. Her mother was not familiar with any of the gear she had brought with her when I asked, and I doubted she was experienced enough to know to bring one. It made me question how she'd gotten so lost to begin with. I closed the binder and walked out of my room into the already humid air. I needed to get a move on myself. It was already later into the morning than I would have liked, and I wanted to have as much daylight as possible. I double-checked all my gear before heading out. The trek to the start of the park was around 3 miles out of Westview. That small town was so accustomed to having visitors that the roads were clearly marked the whole way up. If the rest of the trails were marked this way, I doubt Allison would have gotten lost. I checked my watch as I walked along the side of the main road. Westview was essentially one street with a motel, gift shops, and a camping supply store. The few locals I had seen seemed welcoming enough and treated me as they would any tourist passing through. The town was dead aside from that, their peak busy season having ended a few weeks back. The scenery was picturesque, and one of the reasons I came to this park so often. Conifers made up most of the vegetation and shrubs, moss and grasses covered the floor. The terrain itself was rocky and scarred, making hiking, especially higher up, a challenge. The paved road began to break up under my feet, and eventually I was walking on a narrow gravel road. There were still signs pointing me towards the trailhead, though more spaced out now. I hear commotion up ahead as a dirty red pickup truck whipped around a corner. I sidestepped a bit, giving it more space as I expected it to slow down. It didn't. And as it barreled at me, I stumbled further into the woods to keep the side mirror from hitting me. "Jag off!" I spat after it, as my hand flashed the universal FU. The truck slowed after that and crawled around the next corner. My breath caught a bit as I expected him to reverse and give me what for, but it slowly disappeared out of sight, and I continued for about 20 minutes more before reaching the entrance to the main trail. I knew from giving the diary a once-over before and talking to Ms. Moore, Allison had gone up the main trail before getting turned around and ending up at the cabin. That wasn't a lot to go off, but enough to get me started. The entrance of the park was overgrown, which struck me as odd. Coming off the busy season, I had expected the trail to look less abandoned. Typically, the trail will be naturally cleared by people passing over it, but this one looked like no one had walked over it in months. Nonetheless, I pushed on and up the trail. It was a quiet walk, with the occasional bird call and crunch of an unseen animal somewhere just off the path. After around an hour of walking, the ground began to incline, jagged stones pushing through the dirt and moss. I found a comfortable rock and took off my pack, taking out the binder again and flipping to where I had left off. October 3rd, 2010. It took me a while, but I finally reached the trailhead. It was surprisingly hard to find in the thick trees. A guy named David offered me a ride up, which was nice. The weather is a little shitty today, so I appreciated not having to walk in the rain for a little while. He was listening to Cat Stevens on the way up, and it reminded me of Dad. I'll update again when I reach the foot of the mountain and see how much fun I'm really having. October 3rd, 2010. I'll be honest, that sucked. The rain has finally let up though, and I'm not slipping halfway down the mountain. I walked with a few people up, but they were all way more experienced than me. It's been nice taking my mind off of everything though. I wonder if anyone other than Mom and Sarah will miss me. I'm sure they won't mind the quiet for a moment. I'll check in with them when I set up camp. Not helpful. I thought I was fine reading a dead girl's journal if it helped me figure out where she was. But otherwise, it felt like an invasion of privacy. As I pushed further and further into the woods, the humid warm air slowly began to cool, and it easily dropped 3 of 4 degrees. The sun also began to dissipate, blocked by the canopy until it was barely visible and left traces of streaking beams across the forest floor. By the time I got myself to the base of the summit, it was well past 3 p.m., and I needed to start setting up camp. It was dangerous to be on the mountain at night, especially without shelter. Even in the summer, it could easily drop 10 or more degrees. I, for one, didn't feel like sitting in the elements would be productive, so I set up my tent on a somewhat flat portion of the rock face and set up my stove. The butane flame burned brightly as I started to heat up my dehydrated beans and rice. As that cooked, I again found myself opening the journal. October 3rd, 2010, 6:45 p.m. I finally reached the base of the summit. It took entirely too long with the paths being as covered as they were, and it's cold. I didn't expect the sun to set as fast as it did. It took forever to find a spot for the tent that wasn't wet or too steep. I did manage to find a good enough spot and set up my fire. I had to take my socks off for them to dry, and the cold went all the way to my core. I want to turn around and just head back, but something seems to be calling me up there. I feel like if I can stick this out, I'll be able to finally confront Josh about everything. That prick will get what's coming to him, that's for sure. I think that I will leave something here to mark my accomplishment of getting this far. We'll update tomorrow. I stared at the name, Josh. I felt a chill run up my spine, but I shook it off. Josh was a common enough name, and I certainly had never met her before. I ate in silence, listening to the birds until I read the entry over again. She said she'd leave something here, and if I could find it, I'd know I was on the right path. I put my pot down and looked over the area, sticking near the flatter areas, places she could have camped. Eventually I found it. A small hole in a pine tree sitting above a small open space. I saw a piece of orange fabric inside of it. I stuck my hand in and through an old web before grabbing a hold of something, a stone. The smooth, dark gray rock contained a carving on the backside. A.M. I was right on target, and I felt my heart beat fast with excitement. I would find her. The next few days were relatively uneventful. walking up steep climbs and recessions well into the third day. Allison had left a few more rocks along the trail at each small victory she reached. Her entries detailed this in full, how excited she was and how the hike was so relaxing. It was so full of nothing that I started skipping entries until one that looked to be written at an angle. The ink was smudged and I could barely make it all out. October 7th, 2010. I had been ignoring it, but I feel like I can hear the steps again. Always just behind me. Step, step, stop. Step, step, stop. They always stop when I stop, but a second too late. There is no one else here. The last hiker I saw passed me a day ago. I don't think it's an animal. The movement is too controlled. Step, step, stop. I think I can. The legible entry stops there and becomes borderline indecipherable after. A mess of random letters caught up in the water-damaged page. As I cleared the next mile marker, I couldn't help but think of the steps. How I had seemed to subconsciously mirror the patter she heard. Step, step, stop. Step, step, stop. I righted myself again and took up my usual pace, listening behind myself for anything. Then I heard it. The same rhythmic movements. Step, step, scrape, stop. It continued for around 5 minutes before the noise was gone, replaced by the usual hum of nature.